Good afternoon, Startup Boston Week. This is one of our many People Ops events this week. I might be the most excited for this one. Don't tell anybody else. But before we dive into this conversation, I would love for our audience to just drop into the chat here. Where are you dialing in from? Personally, for me, I'm in Cambridge, Mass. How about you, Paul? Where are you dialing in from?
I'm in Harlem, New York.
Love it. Love it. Jamal, how about you?
I am in Braintree, Massachusetts.
All right. Local, Laura?
Also Boston, Massachusetts.
Perfect. And Amber?
We've got Brooklyn in the house.
Hey.
Woo, woo. Love to hear it. Ooh, we got Maine. Welcome, Morgan. Very cool. Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. As I said, my name is Allison. I am one of the organizers for this volunteer-driven event. On my screen, if I can remember to share. Oop, there we go. All right. Right now, you are in the panel, A Culture of Belonging, How to Develop a Diversity and Inclusion Strategy That Works. Yes. And if you are looking for one of these other two panels here, Raising Growth Capital Through Regulation A or Schools Out, you are in the wrong place, unfortunately, and you're going to want to click that agenda button at the top and navigate to find your desired panel. But we've got the best lineup, so don't leave us. Okay. All right. So ultimately, while we're waiting for people to navigate around, just as a reminder, we absolutely love questions. So please use that Q&A tab in the far right of your screen to submit any questions that you may have during this session. That's why we created this conference. It's for your learning. So please ask us questions. And one last thing to highlight, we also have an awesome social media competition happening right meow. In short, if you're paying attention to what our speakers are saying and you quote one of them on social media using the hashtag SBW2021, you will then be entered to win one of 5 $100 gift cards to a Black-owned Boston business. So again, that is hashtag SBW2021. Use it on social media, quote our speakers. And with that, I will pass things over to our amazing moderator, Mr. Paul Tucker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Allison, so much. Excited to be with you all. So we'll jump into some questions, as Allison mentioned. So the way this will work is we'll spend some time. I have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask our amazing panelists. So I'll start off with that, and we'll leave some time at the end. Again, use the Q&A function. Send those questions to us. You can upvote them. So if there are other questions or questions that you want to really have the panelists answer, we will make sure to make time for that toward the end. To start, I guess we'll go around and do introductions. I'll go first. My name is Paul Tucker. As I mentioned, I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the Diversity and Inclusion Program Manager at ActBlue. ActBlue is a fundraising platform for progressive candidates, causes, and organizations. Our mission is to fuel long-term progressive people power change. And we do that principally by building the tech and the infrastructure that supports that change. We really believe in the power of everyday people to contribute to the shaping of our country and the forming of our futures. So really excited to be with all of you. And with that, I will pass it over to Laura.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Super excited to be here. My name is Laura Ladd, and I am the manager of global talent acquisition here at Flywire. We are a fintech payments company based in Boston, Massachusetts. So yeah, very excited to again be a part of this session and connect with you all and talk about this super important topic.
Great. Amber, how about you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Amber Jones, and I'm the Senior Operations Manager at Lethos, whose mission it is to put more money into independents' pockets by providing an all-in-one solution for freelancers, studio founders, and entrepreneurs to simplify their back office management to capture those larger profit margins for their businesses. And as I mentioned earlier, I am Brooklyn-based. My pronouns are she, her. And I've also led the company's DEI strategy since last fall, and we've been scaling it from there. So thanks for Startup Boston, the whole crew, for having me. And I'm very much looking forward to digging in a little bit deeper with my fellow panelists.
Awesome. Jamal.
All right, I get to close out introductions. My name is Jamal Thompson. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Vice President of Strategic Projects at Panorama Education. Our organization our mission is to radically improve education, particularly with a student focus. So we work with school districts to utilize data in support of equity and improving outcomes for all students, right? We can't have conversations about improving outcomes for students that are divorced from equity. And so much of our landscape when we work with clients is to think about what systems or processes need to be addressed or modified to support our students more holistically. And in the same way, in my work at strategic projects, I have focused and led a lot of the DEI initiatives in the organization, knowing that DEI is not its own thing, but it needs to be interwoven with everything that happens in the organization. And special love for Amber, if you can't hear the accent, thick Brooklyn accent, even though I have a Massachusetts transplant.
That's right. Brooklyn got to represent. I'm in Harlem. I'll represent Harlem. But great. You already, started the conversation by way of your introduction, Jamal. So again, everyone, lots of questions that I have for our panelists. You can use the Q&A feature to ask as well as we go along. But jumping right in, and Jamal, we'll start with you. From my experience, strategy is really about setting a vision. At the same time, it's also about making choices, and hard choices at that. So when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you develop a strategy? How do you set a vision and make those hard choices? Like, how do you say, this is what we are going to do, this is what we're not going to do?
Yeah, this is an important question, a very grounding question. I'm glad that Paul, we're starting here. Mm-hmm. A lot of it depends on where your organization is at, where are you at, right? And being a data company, like whatever data that you have should guide a little bit of how you think about the strategy of your organization. And so I'm going to actually step away from Panorama for a quick second and speak to an experience that I have here locally in Braintree in Massachusetts. I sit on the DEI committee working with students. And when I worked with the principal there and with the DEI crew, when she talked about strategy, I'm like, well, where do you want to start? Where are our teachers at? What outcomes are you looking to achieve? And so there are typically a set of like discovery questions that are based off of like, where is your actual landscape as an organization? Right. And where do you want to be at? And I think those can be tough conversations, right? And data makes those more grounded conversations because it's not this anecdotal information. You're able to look cleanly at the experiences of team members and to say, okay, this is where we're at. This is where we're trying to get to. We're doing a little bit of a gap analysis. This is how we think about it. I would say in terms of like thinking about our organization and like where we've gotten it right and where we've gotten it wrong is in a caution to many organizations is be wary when you do this work of having a check the box mentality, right? And so for us, sequencing was something that was really important as we thought, Paul, about the work. Yeah. It was like, oh, we're doing microaggressions trainings and we're doing inclusive management training. We're doing all of these things. And it's like, wait, hold on a second. Are our leaders on board? What's the commitment look like at the top level before we start doing all of these type of works? And so thinking, I guess, in terms of guidance, thinking about like, where's your organization at? Where are you trying to get to? What kind of buy-in do you have? What type of resources do you have? And then who are the people in the organization that are going to be able to help to support you? We were lucky enough early on to have a lot of support, particularly from our individual contributors. And we have a huge teaching and learning team. And they were going out and they were working with districts. And so we were able to leverage some of that. But I think some of our redirecting what's working better for us as we think about strategy is like actually doing less things, but doing them really, really well and with intentionality has focused for us. Lately, when I helped with kind of redirecting our DEIB strategy, because ours is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I subtracted and I was like, okay, let's start at the tier 1 level, the universal support. and say, okay, what are the things? Okay, inclusive management, right? Inclusive leadership. That's going to be our core, our crux. And the other piece, which folks may not like tie or think about when they think about DEI through that lens, also is feedback. Was the other piece of it, right? This is a piece that touches everybody in the organization. It touches managers, it touches individual contributors. And when we were working with Life Labs, one of the things that we learned is, particularly from an identity perspective, folks from traditionally marginalized identities don't receive that feedback. Women receive blurrier feedback. And so I would say, like, think about where you're at, but also think about those components that don't naturally signal DEI or diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but are very, very imperative. And so as you plot it out, just think about it, okay, and we want to have a little bit of a growth arc. So don't set too ambitious of a scope, especially when you first start. That's what I've learned. Like start with intentionality, ground it, and then think about where do I have that buy-in from the leadership level to make sure that this happens. Otherwise, right, we can do a microaggressions training, we can do an anti-racism training, but do they really stick? Do they really move the needle? Do they help people to care about people in different ways?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jamal. Yeah, that makes me think, you know, not only like you talked about not making sure that you don't have the check the box mentality, that the EIB is not its own separate thing, really thinking about the organization, the business as a whole. And I think a lot of that too, as you mentioned, is contextual. Like, where are we as an organization? So thinking particularly about Act Blue, like we're a mid-sized organization that's continuing to grow. What do we need, and how do we build, integrate the EIB into all of the things that we need as an organization? And part of that, I think you're right on, is inclusive leadership, inclusive management, decentralizing decision making as we grow as an organization, and thinking about the biases that operate in the decision making process, and using that as a vehicle to have some of these really transformative conversations. So that's awesome. Amber, what about you? Jamal talked about sometimes strategy is like, hey, let's actually pare this down a little bit, but let's do this really well. What has strategy looked like for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally am feeling everything that Jamal has put down. For us at Wethos, we work with a consultant because a lot of the times you don't know where and how to start. We knew overall that DE&I was something that we did care about as a company, but like anyone else, we were afraid of making mistakes or putting forth those empty promises, which we did see a lot of, especially last year. So we knew that this was something that we did want to commit to, and we even created a value behind that. And we ultimately just needed that extra step and that extra help from an expert to be able to hold ourselves and one another accountable. We, similarly to Jamal, we kind of use what was actually happening at the company, looking at our policies, our demographic information, our job descriptions, our website language. And we did that to assess the trends, the gaps, and the opportunities to build that initial strategy. And one thing that you have to be so good about when you're coming into this space is that you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You ultimately have to be open to see the reality of your work environment. You got to be ready to hear those opinions and that critical, tough feedback from those on the ground. And then you take that feedback, not as a personal attack, but that is a starting point to educate yourself, to actively listen, and to be ready to grow and learn from there. And another thing that I want to point out that our consultant gave us was that we should be setting guiding principles for the program. This allows us to be really clear and intentional on the why behind the work that we're doing. This allows us to understand okay, cool, we can work with others in the space who are committed to doing that work. We can find ways to make that work engaging, and then we can influence the team around you, and then you'll see an impact being made. It's almost like a domino effect. And kind of like Jamal had said, you need to be realistic with where you are and the company and where you all are in the journey. And startups, we tend to be cash strapped. So you need to make sure that there is budget to support the program, bottom line, whether that is through hiring a consultant or doing specified initiatives that have budget attached, workshops, webinars, readings, you name it, the list goes on. For us, after working with our consultant, she helped us build the foundation, and based on our time with her over a span of a quarter, we felt confident enough to take that program on independently and use the tools that we were given as a baseline to scale. And we knew overall that like it wasn't going to be easy. We were definitely going to make mistakes, but ultimately the goal was let's create that culture of belonging within the organization simply because it's the right thing to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Amber. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I totally hear you on the consultants playing a huge role at ActBlue. We have harnessed the capacities and the expertise and the wisdom of our consultants on the DEI front, and that has been really, really helpful. But now we, as we are building out what diversity and equity, inclusion, and belonging looks like as an organization, we're slowly but surely building our capacities to take on that work in a more full, sort of wholehearted way. So really excited to hear that. So changing tacks a little bit, but also thinking about guiding principles. Like, as much as we would all like it, we operate in a world of limited resources, right? There's also scrutiny about the business case for diversity in certain places, but definitely the ROI. So Laura, from your experience, thinking again about guiding principles, what programs, projects, or initiatives have provided the most value, perhaps the greatest outcomes per dollar invested from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this topic, and shout out to our Flymates First committee. Really excited to talk about them today. But we have at Flywire what's called Flymates First. This started as an affinity group, a group of Flymates from around the world who believed in DE&I and wanted to bring these principles to Flywire. And one of the things that we also do at Flywire is whenever we have an affinity group, we always start with an executive sponsor. I think that this is kind of getting to Jamal's point when he said, well, do we have executive support, right? We have to get that from the top down first. So when this affinity group started, in January of 2019, we make sure that that executive sponsor is there to give that voice. That comes at no cost, which is a wonderful thing when you're strapped for cash. So having that executive sponsor off the bat for all of our affinity groups, I think is super important because it brings that voice to the table, at that level when you need support or guidance. So our Flymates First group has grown a ton, and it is amazing. I'm a member myself, and the programs that we do are, of course, absolutely fantastic, and a lot come at a low budget. So when you think about programs that you can do, one of the things that we did last year was an ally training. This was a training that we put together, as a committee, right, to talk about what is ally, what does it mean to be an ally? What is an ally? How can you be an active ally? And then open forums to talk about allyship, right? So you got a certificate at the end when you completed it. Everyone likes hanging those at their desk when we had desks. So, things like this, companies that are, at this size and scale, training like these are something that the company can do to spread awareness, share knowledge, share best practices, and it doesn't have to come on a heavy budget. So things like this, for example, are one thing that we have done that was absolutely fantastic and super impactful. Another one that we implemented 2 years ago or last year was what we called Fly Better Days. So clearly we like fly, the word fly at Flywire.
Making use of that theme, yep.
Yeah. But it is our Fly Better Days are actually volunteer days that we have given in partnership as 2 additional days off a year where we want people to give back to any nonprofit or social justice cause of their choice. We have a Slack channel about it so that when Flymates take their Fly Better Days, they talk about it. They can bring Flymates into do if they are interested in the same activity or cause that one Flymate is doing. So again, this kind of comes at no cost if you can get that time off, but different creative ways to be spreading awareness, getting your message out, I think for us has been very, very impactful at a low budget.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, we're also we have employee resource groups at ActBlue as well, and we're thinking about as we build them out and make them more robust. Yeah, what are the ways in which volunteering might be a part of the conversation as well, and just diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work in general. So Amber, I saw you nodding your head a lot as Laura was talking. any thoughts on your end as to what has been worked out really well for you in this regard?
Yeah, we're a tiny team. I think there's literally like 15 of us. So for me, in my experience, like if you have like an existing people operations or an HR budget, I do think that is a great place to start. DE&I, in my opinion, goes along with learning and development. So if you as a company have a desire to help your team grow, DEI trainings, some of the things that we had mentioned earlier, inclusive leadership, unconscious bias, even diverse and inclusive hiring practices. Those are just a few topics that make your leaders more influential. They then set a positive example to peers and the team around them. And obviously, it's an easy way to find your competitive advantage across like pretty oversaturated markets. Of course, it all kind of comes down to, is your program done with the best intention? And how transparent and clear are you being with your actions? And any programs or initiatives that you can clearly tie back to business impact will be like a surefire way to gain that buy-in and get clearer engagement from the team around you if that is something that you're struggling with. We found success in our team thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that you don't typically think of, that those out-of-the-box approaches that Jamal and Laura have already kind of touched on, which tend to simply fall on race, gender, and sexual identity. So, for instance, as an example, I work in fintech, and in our industry, we rely so much on data because that basically tells us, are we doing okay? Or are we not doing okay? You know?
Right.
But as I mentioned earlier, like our mission is to put more money into independence pockets. So how did DEI fit in there for us? We did work with our consultant to give us feedback on an existing data strategy that we had developed. And she did help us think of some other approaches of how we can gather specific types of data to fulfill that mission. So what I will say out of all of that, without getting into the nitty gritty of what that strategy was, nobody cares about that. If you do, if you care about data and you need some help, please talk to me. But what I will say is that we can now critically think of ways as to how our commitments will be positive for our user base. And before then, I never realized that we could take the strategy there and how much it actually excited the team as much as it did.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. And finding ways to tie it all together is really, really impactful for sure. Changing tack again a little bit, Jamal, back to you. What does it take to build a culture of belonging and authenticity? Like, are there particular characteristics or components you found either, really critical or vital in the work that you've done?
Yeah, I love this question, Paul, and vulnerably, because I think it's important, and Amber, I think you were talking about this before. I think when it comes to diversity, equity, we're the strongest as an organization. I think where the biggest growth for us is on the inclusion and belonging space. And a lot of the work that I have been trying to lead the organization is with that particularly in mind. And the data tells it, right? And I say this because we saw, like many companies, exits of team members of color from the organization. We saw exits amongst senior leaders of color in our organization, and it led to some super soul searching. It did lead to what Amber was talking about also, in bringing in some consultants to give us a little bit of outside data points. And so I go into the section on inclusion and belonging saying, like, if you can't, take that pill and that dose and realize, right, where you're having struggles or where there are opportunities for growth, because I don't believe in deficit-based mindset. I believe in asset-based mindset. I think it can be really difficult because you got to see, where am I struggling or where's there growth opportunities for an organization? So there are a couple of things that we're working on in that space. One of the things, Panorama, we call them panel resource groups, Laura. So you call them fly groups. So we'll get into that in a second. We got to make panel a part of everything too. So totally agree with you on that.
Yeah.
So a couple of things, right? And so when we respect this diverse talent, I think this year our talent acquisition team brought in 45% of the people that we brought into the organization this year we're scaling fast as an organization, identify as Black and Indigenous people of color, right? So when I say that we're doing a really good job in bringing in folks of diverse backgrounds and perspectives, we've got that, right? From an equity lens, some of the things that Amber has talked about, we've done a really good, we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? Same thing on the inclusion piece, right? I'm just like, okay, it's really, really important that we think about celebrating that diverse perspective and those identities from the day somebody walks in the door, right? They're contributing to the culture of your organization, right? They can bring great mindsets on day one to your organization. And so what are some of the things that you can do that I'm seeing work for us? Right now, I know we were talking about this backstage. We're supporting Latinx / Hispanic Heritage Month. We do Heritage Month celebrations. There's been great growth for us as an organization in moving away from just celebration to education celebration and like not spotlighting folks during a thematic month, but trying to really understand who they are from all identity perspectives throughout the year. So that's a growth area for us, but we've got some strength there. A project that I'm co-leading right now at Panorama is called Culture At. So we reset values for the organization, and we're setting aspirations for our culture. We've been doing like this great remodeling, as I would say, of our culture because of some of the data points that I shared with you earlier. And one aspect of that is like, what do team members tell us? Where do they feel a great sense of belonging? And so we had focus group conversations, and folks share with us, hey, back when we were in the lunchroom, right? Getting opportunity to sit next to someone and speak to people. We have what we call Noras, which pulls the Nora from Panorama, and we have like an AI thing that like assigns you randomly to speak with someone in the organization. And so you get a chance to meet with different members of the team. But again, that Culture At is something that I'm really excited about. It's about to go out to the company. So even the internal people don't know the full flex that is going to come here. It's going to be exciting. Yeah. But we're working on the onboarding for that and saying like, well, what do we want the experiences of new team members to know? Feedback, especially y'all will resonate in the startup world, is like, if you come into an organization, there's a lot of things that are happening. Well, what's true about that organization? What exists outside of your company values? And I had a team member who said to us, how do we basically catch up folks, accelerate their learning curve as they join the organization? So outside of the traditional onboarding, right? Well, what's true? How do we give and receive feedback in this organization? How do we build and foster belonging? Why do results matter to us in the organization? Why do we talk about financial stuff when we're talking about students, right? And it's like, okay, we got to keep the lights on too, right? And having the lights on give us the impact. So some of the learnings that we've had is like what's true for us as an organization, and creating belonging comes from listening to our team members and honoring their voices. And through this process of the Culture At, we've learned a lot. And some advice that I would give to you all as you think about like some of this type of work that has worked well for us is we did something that was very interesting when we set up the focus groups for the Culture At work, which is we actually we created a super inclusive process and opened it up to everyone. But we specifically said, hey, I want to speak to folks from specific identities. And we tried to make sure that as we had focus groups, right, that we were thinking about gender and sexual orientation and team composition and all of those different pieces and tenure within the organization, so that we had rich feedback from different perspectives, managers versus individual contributors. And it made the feedback that we received so much richer because folks could identify with folks in the focus groups. So again, thinking about, and whether your team is small or it's large, solicit and figure out and ask folks, when you felt a strong sense of belonging in the organization, what did that look like? What did it feel like? What did it feel like in other organizations as well? And then the last piece I'll share with you, we talked about employee resources groups. At the panel resource groups have been huge for us, right? Because I would say where we struggled at was like the awareness piece was, we were there as an organization, right? We knew things needed to change, right? It was the action piece was the struggle bus, right? It was like, no, we need to take action on this data, on these feelings, these things that we know that need to change or shift. And the resources groups, which we rolled out in June of this year, so they're relatively new for us. I broke all the rules of resource groups by saying we're actually going to start with the groups who are having the most disparate experiences within the organization. So we're not going to open up to every group. We're going to focus on 4 groups who are having the most disparate experiences. And within those groups, we're going to set the goals on what we want to accomplish. And that has been really successful, not in just the awareness piece, but actually causing the action. And a big focus of each of those groups is on inclusion and belonging as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really stands out from what you shared, Jamal, is of just thinking about, acknowledging, recognizing, sort of honoring the experience of folks who work at your organization, really respecting that. Doing some education around that, and then empathy just showed up so strong for me, trained as a social worker. So, I look for that all the time. But that is so true. Like, you're really listening, really putting yourself in another person's shoes, and really understanding things to the best extent that you possibly can. So thank you for that. We're actually going to open up a poll. So I'm going to open it now. And the question really is, what's the biggest challenge you face with your DEI program? We want to get some audience feedback and participation. So really excited to hear, what's been the biggest challenge you face with your DEI programs. I'm seeing it as it forms. There's leadership buy-in. It seems to be something that folks are recognizing as a particular challenge. A little bit of employee engagement, not knowing where to start. I mean, we talked about that a little bit earlier, that's really hard. And, the role of consultants, some folks with more expertise, some wisdom to bring to the table can really help you figure out how to best take your initial steps, what to prioritize, all of that. Yeah, it still seems, employee engagement is still there a little bit. Budget constraints show up for sure, but it seems like leadership buy-in continues to be a theme. So, and I think this was in the Q&A as well. There was a comment or a question about what is the best way, to follow up on Laura's comment about executive sponsorship, and Amber's mentioning of it. What is the best way to gain buy-in from senior leaders on DEI initiatives? So we'll go ahead and ask that question. I'm not sure who wants to take it, but
I can start, Amber, if you want.
Go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So this might sound, so I would say first and foremost, we are very lucky at Flywire to have executives that have always believed in and supported this work. I think, again, even the fact that, and that came from the executive tab, right? The executive team, in the sense of, always having executive sponsors for the affinity group. So I do have to give a call out, we're very lucky. But, it's one of the things, I know this might sound silly, but startups are small, right, guys? A lot of us are, small size companies, 100 people, 50 people, 75 people, 200 people. You could just ask. If I don't know, put 15 minutes on their, one of their calendars. If you feel comfortable, that's very much a me thing. I always say, hey, unless you ask, it's always a no. So, so in the sense of, just see if you can have a coffee chat with one of your executives, talk with your manager, just put 15 minutes on their calendar for a coffee chat and say, hey, I'm interested in that. What are your thoughts? What do you think? Is this something we could do? It might just be that no one's brought this to their attention, or they've gotten to have an honest or raw conversation about it, or really asked their thoughts or insights about it, right? A lot of times I'm just going to say, I'm going to say the majority of the employees might think that executives are thinking one way or another, but has anyone actually just had a one-on-one conversation with them about it and what their thoughts are? So maybe you can be the person at your company to take that initiative. But again, I just simply think asking is a really good place to start, as simple as that may sound.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Laura, because when now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking there often is sort of the same process going on, or the same assumption going on, at the ground level and then at the higher level, right? we don't ask the question of senior leaders. We don't necessarily ask the question of folks on the front line or our individual contributors or even our people managers, and we can then operate with these assumptions that aren't really helpful. So thank you for sharing that. Amber, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, just really quickly, but yeah, I agree with everything that Laura said. Like, I also am like, okay, if you feel brave or if you have that type of rapport with leadership, put the onus on them to really tell us like why or why not this is something that we should be investing in versus not, you know? If that doesn't work, of course, you can always tie things back to data. I've talked about data a couple times. I'm obsessed with data. But if you're looking for a place to start and you have an idea, let's say we're talking about, okay, we want to reduce employee turnover. Like, if you have some data that already exists in your arsenal that you can pull from, tie it back once again to the business impact, and, you know, just be really clear about what the short-term and the long-term impact is going to be. Best of luck for everybody who is struggling in that area, though, because there's not an easy answer. There are a couple different approaches, and I hope like anything that we've mentioned is at least helpful as a starting point.
Yeah, totally agree. You know, hopefully all of this allows folks to take their initial steps or their next step wherever they are in the process. So we'll come back to the questions in the Q&A in a moment, but want to think about, you know, we asked the audience about their biggest challenge. So I'm curious, what's the biggest mistake you or your organization have made when it comes to DEI? So, you know, Jamal, your point about sequencing is one that I think at ActBlue we're currently working through. But Amber, you know, going back to you, you know, what was this mistake that you or your organization learned most from, and how have you applied that learning since then?
Yeah, totally. So when we had first started working with our consultant, which, by the way, her name is Adriel Parker. She's New York based. She's absolutely amazing. But when we first started the strategy, it was just myself and my two co-founders kind of leading the helm, because we were focused on cleaning up our internal house, and then we would bring in other stakeholders across various departments to get involved. But I will say that mistakes for me was not leaning on my team enough in the beginning. You know, we know it's an organization-wide effort to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging is deeply embedded within the pulse of your company. So creating councils or committees to do the work together, or at the very least compensating anyone for those D&I efforts, especially if they fall outside of their day-to-day responsibilities. I think that's really important to the success of the program. One person can definitely create impact, but doesn't it feel more rewarding when everybody, the whole team, can say that like we're really proud of doing the work, you know? But luckily I had the support from my co-founders every step of the way as I developed, collaborated with the team to set goals, and ultimately scaled the program, which has made the efforts that much more worthwhile. And I've also created a space for other team members to continue to step up and to keep that program alive and more leadership-oriented focuses when it comes to our program.
Yeah, awesome. Jamal, do you want to add to that as well?
You know, I wanted to add to that. Anything I could do to back up what Amber is sharing, that vulnerability, I think is really important, because this work is hard. And we got to recognize we're going to make mistakes, right? If you're really doing this work intentionally, you're going to make mistakes, and you have to own those mistakes as well. And so for us, I think a lot of it we've tied into, we're like thinking about that systems level work needed to happen, that foundational level work, and thinking about, okay, what do our managers actually look like from a representative standpoint, right? We say that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging mean a lot for us in the organization. What do the people leaders look like? What do the people who we are advancing look like in our organization? Who's leaving? Are we having honest conversations about those things? We weren't comfortable of having those conversations about things where your house is a little dirty, right? You got folks coming into your house and you're like, my house is a little dirty. It needs to be cleaned up. We need to be able to have those conversations. And by honoring that, it allowed us to look into our interview practices. I think Amber and Laura were talking about this earlier, to remove bias, to look at what are ways that we can help to grow particularly our folks who identify as Black and Indigenous people of color as leaders in the organization. We said it was important, right, as an organization, but when I'm looking at that data, when Jamal joined the organization, I was one of 2 leaders of color, people who identified as color in the entire organization, right? I think we were about 120 folks then. I think we've scaled over the last 3 years to 280. And our people leaders of color are about 27, 28%. We had this great growth over a 6-month period, and a lot of that came from looking at those interview practices. What were we doing from an internal mobility perspective? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of our team members of color were also leading that work, to Amber's point, unpaid labor, but they weren't getting the benefit of growing within the organization. And so one of the things that we changed in our interview profiles, particularly for all individual contributors, but especially the onus is on people leaders, is to showcase, as I call it, the receipts around this work. Okay, the receipts, not like, oh, I read a book. No, like, what are you doing that are actively showcasing your belief in this work? And so also, and I think Amber talked about this a little while ago too, is like, it can't be its own thing. For us, having a value around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, and also having a value around care about people, also was a safeguard about against some of the unintentional harm that was happening for us when we entered into conversations about bias or unconscious bias or anti-racism, so that if we're going to engage in this conversation, we need the psychological safety, and we need to make sure that we're calling in people instead of calling them out, and particularly in not calling people out in public spaces, which was toxic for us as an organization. And so like thinking about how do we create the right environment and spaces and make sure that we're cleaning our dirty house. In the process were huge learning opportunities, and being more comfortable sharing with the company when we're making mistakes, or, you know, where the data doesn't look as great. You know, what that has looked like has been a big part of like what we got wrong a lot. And then I'll give you one last piece for us too, was also around communication. What we started to realize is there were narratives that we were hearing in the company about the work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we realized it wasn't that the work wasn't being done, especially as we've shifted in the last 6 months. It was that we weren't doing an effective job in communicating what was happening. And I'm really happy through our consultants who have provided guidance, like Amber said, we launched our first diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging newsletter, which profiled the work, and it kind of reset people's minds to say, hey, it's not the head of DEIB who's doing the work. We've got the affinity group, we've got the ERGs, we'll have an inclusion council, we have all of these things, but we're also looking at compensation and pay and benefits, and making sure that our parental leave policy is fair, no matter if you're an adoptive parent, right? Adoptive parent, a birth parent, a non-birth parent, and like all of those things. And so like, I think where we've done better, especially where we were challenged before, is like, we weren't really good with the communication, and we're getting better. We're not perfect there, but like, think about your communication is what I'm going to say to you, and think about how do you share both your wins and how do you share where you're struggling a little bit with the team.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jamal. I think, you know, the vulnerability really shows up in our ability to communicate what we're doing and what's working and what's not working. Like we really, you know, at Act Blue, I think as well, like there are some things that are happening, but there may not be all the clarity or the insight or the transparency around what is happening. When we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging holistically, all of the things that we're doing, you know, we know that employee resource groups are happening, but what else is going on, and how do we communicate about that? Even when it's not super polished, it's still sort of developing, and it's still, you know, we're going to learn about it, and we're going to make mistakes as we learn, but we're going to grow. That can be really uncomfortable, but cultivating the psychological safety, nurturing the trust that would allow that to happen, I think is so vital. And internal communications for any organization is always like such a struggle in and of itself, but, you know, mixed in with this is really, really particularly challenging. So, you know, there's another question in the Q&A that I want to highlight. Freddie Montgomery. Hey, Freddie. So Freddie is he works in recruitment, you know, and to the point of thinking about folks of color or folks from underrepresented groups, like, what are some metrics that y'all use or are thinking about as it relates to recruitment? So metrics specifically for recruiting teams, you know, to what extent does that relate to referrals? How do we really think about this?
Yeah, I can kick off this one.
Go ahead, Laura.
As in TA. So I absolutely think so hi Freddie, great question. I think this is a topic that everyone in recruitment and talent acquisition is talking about right now. And it's certainly a hot topic, I think, for TA, because recruitment is one of the many factors that come into this topic. And I think a lot of people go to right away when thinking about DE&I. So I certainly think, but to your point, though, I think that these are goals that should be set for the entire company, because again, for DE&I to work, it can't just be TA, right? Because you have to get there's so much more that goes into it. One of the things I think, even going to Jamal's point, and he said it, so beautifully, is, and we have our CPO has actually kind of started talking to TA about, is that when you think about DE&I, you should almost think about it as not DE&I, but IE and D, right? Do you have an inclusive culture first in place, right? Where you can bring in and recruit talent that they can feel like they can come in and be their true selves at work. Second, do you have an equitable environment when thinking about promotions, right? Thinking about opportunities given. What is that, middle management, top management look like, right? So do you have fair and objective philosophies and practice in place? If you do those two things first, diversity should be easy, right? So in the sense, right? So getting those first philosophies in place first, I think, are super important. So when you think about recruitment, I would be thinking about those metrics first, and do we have these things in place first? And then when you're setting your DE&IB goals, right? I think absolutely that TA can have the goals for themselves, right? When it comes to recruiting metrics, Jamal just gave amazing numbers that his company is doing, right? But you want to have those other foundations in place. You want to have an inclusive environment. You want to have an equitable opportunity, because retention is then the second part of recruitment that is super, super important, right? So if you're bringing in this diverse talent, you want to make sure that your company can keep them, right? And create that overall company-wide those values. So I think to your question, that absolutely recruiting can have their goals, but they should be goals that the entire company knows about and is supporting, because again, recruiting, we work hand in hand with your hiring managers. So your hiring managers need to be aware of these goals and also be supportive of these goals, right? So I would be ensure that these TA goals that you're setting, you're getting buy-in from the entire company.
Yeah. Love
Hopefully
that, Laura.
helps.
And love it. And thank you for, sort of flipping the order of the words. I think that really shifts the dynamics entirely, and thinking about what are we inviting people, including people into, right? Like, what is this space? What is this culture? Is it going to be a space where they can thrive, where they can grow and scale along with the company? I think that's so critical. So thank you. Any other thoughts on this topic before we move on? I mean, there's so much in here, I think, as I'm particularly thinking about the Great Resignation. And I hope, there's conversations about whether it's hyped up or whether it's, actually true and real. But I feel like people are making moves and really looking at this past year and a half has been really, really transformational in a lot of ways, and it has caused people to think about their priorities and what they're doing with their lives, and what organizations they align themselves to, what they want to work for. So I think this has such critical and urgent importance for employers, for organizations. But to the conversation we've had thus far, like, folks have to be porous and open and receptive and willing to have these conversations. But with that, any other thoughts before we move on?
I'll add something to that,
Yeah.
Paul. One thing that companies have to think about, especially when you think about or make the connection to the Great Resignation, we have a great set of chief human resource officer consultants right now who are providing us additional support. And they introduced this phrase to me that I hadn't heard of before, which I just lean on because it's organizational debt, right? As we think about the turnover that we're seeing, especially amongst members from traditionally marginalized identities or from underrepresented groups, it's like it touches to what Laura was just talking about in that previous question, right? If you're not setting an inclusive environment within your organization, then it puts you at risk. Especially during a time period like this, where folks have choice in where they want to work. And do they see a company who has a commitment to change if you're not getting it right? And so I think it's really, really important to think about that. So double down on the feedback that folks are giving you in the organization, right? We do this giant culture and climate survey twice a year. And I'm going to share a little bit about our dirty house there too. We were doing this survey, we're a feedback company, and we were hearing feedback, especially from our traditionally marginalized identities, folks from traditionally marginalized identities. And it was saying, hey, I'm having different experiences particularly from our white team members, right? Where, especially at that time, the composition of the organization was something like 2/3 folks were identified as white, right? And so that was the bulk of the organization. You had a smaller group, small but mighty group that's like, hey, I'm not having the same experiences as other folks. Honor that, right? They're giving you their sweat, they're giving you their blood, their sweat, and their tears, and they're sharing with you either through the survey or speaking with HR about their experiences. Well, what are you doing, right? What are you changing as a result, right? And so you have to be proactive in thinking about these experiences. And so make sure that DEI or DEIMB is not reactive, that it's a proactive mechanism that you're using as part of your organizational strategy. I think that also ties back to how do you get that buy-in from the leadership level? Be proactive. That's how you get you put the data in front and you be proactive and say, hey, this is our strongest talent retention strategy, is to double down on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Right.
And so again, think about that feedback, and I'll share with you, as the person who manages the culture and climate survey, I remember sitting with the CEO of the company, my boss, and saying, hey, I'm a little nervous about what our participation rate is going to look like coming into this quarter. And I was surprised that we had our highest participation rate at 99%. Wow. And our team members, that told me there was hope, right? And that the work that we're doing is working. There's still opportunities for improvement. And folks gave us something like 2,000 comments, right? So they took the survey, they provided the comments, and then we acted on it. And for the first time, we sat in front of the company. We debriefed within a certain period of time with the company. We told them what were the action items that we were going to take as a result of it. And I think that was the catalyst, right? As we think about, but also think about what I said about organizational debt, right? Which is like, we knew that there was going to be a certain level of attrition in the organization because we didn't honor the feedback that we had been receiving, especially from folks from traditionally marginalized identities. So think about that. And also think about, what does that say? They're saying windows and mirrors, right? As you think about what folks need to be able to see that they can grow in your organization, and they're looking at managers and they're looking at who is getting promoted and who's not getting promoted, because that's telling you about the culture of your organization. It's telling you about DEI and what the company really truly believes in. And so just think about all of those pieces and think about, am I being proactive with my talent retention strategy and linking it to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or is it just something separate? And you will get the buy-in from leadership when you focus on talent retention, because we all know it costs a lot of money to attract new folks, especially when we have great people in our organization who are really, really vibrant members of our culture.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I mean, we're thinking at ActBlue, I'm particularly interested, like, what's the cost to acquire folks, and what would this mean if retention were to increase? What would it mean for particular teams, that have, huge portfolios of work, all of those things. And I think, Jamal, it's so good to hear that, your organization really digested the feedback. And I think you're getting 99% participation rate in the latest survey is indicative of, like, we actually hear what you're saying. You know, your leaders are saying, we hear you and we're going to do something about this, right? It's so important to do that. And it's hard because there's so much to be done. And I think this again gets to the vulnerability and the, you know, wanting to be perfect or have everything polished, but not being able to do that. Is like, these are some hard choices too. Like, this is what we're going to prioritize. These are our next actions. These are our priorities based on this survey data. And from, you know, at the next iteration, hopefully we're in a better place and we'll commit to these things, right? But it's really, really trying to do that. But that can be scary and frightening in a certain way. So, you know, we have just a few minutes left. Before we close out, I love this book. So I used to work at NYU, and I got to know a professor. Her name is Pamela Newkirk. She wrote a book called Diversity Inc. If you don't have it, go get it. It's amazing. But she really talks about diversity as an $8 billion a year industry, and not much has changed over the course of the past 30 years when we really look at sort of corporate America and other sectors as well. But she says something that is both hopeful and then, you know, encourages us to do better. So she says, in the end, we will each be judged not by stated principles, but by our achievements. When you look at your role or your career, your work in DEI, what do you want to be your accomplishments? So the question to all of you. What do you hope will be your accomplishment?
I'll kick us off.
Okay.
I think for me, I want there to be just more open conversations across the board, from leadership down to our most junior level employee. I want to make sure that there is like an open door to just like ask questions, encourage curiosity, you know, again, not being afraid to have missteps, you know, and use those missteps as learning opportunities. So I think just being vulnerable and being realistic about like, hey, we're human and this is what humans do. Let's just do the work to do better. I think having that type of awareness is definitely something that I want to continue to see grow in my organization. And I hope to see grow in various organizations, from the folks on this stage and beyond.
Thanks, Amber. Jamal, Laura, thoughts?
I can go next. I'll go next. Yeah, no, I think I would hit even just on what Jamal was talking about, and I think it's also part of the talent acquisition coming out of me. But I think to the point of, you know, we work so hard to bring in great people, right? And you have so many amazing people that work at this company that my hope is to just ensure that we always have an environment where people feel safe and they can be themselves, and they are in an environment where they feel you know, there is opportunity to grow and develop. You know, that is, so I would say, you know, just to ensure that we are always creating an environment for our employees where they feel, you know, they can be themselves and feel they are growing personally and professionally, and are hopefully, you know, going home every day with a great experience surrounded by amazing coworkers. That is my goal.
Yeah, Laura, well said. I think I would add, authenticity is like everything to me, and folks being able to see role models who look like them in the organization, and me be able to support that growth, that I think is really, really important. Especially like I look at the team survey, and I'm all over that. What do our managers look like? You know, because I think that's really important. But also like celebrating diversity more holistically within the organization, and thinking about it from age and tenure and sexual orientation and race and all those different facets and identities. I think sometimes when we do diversity, equity, inclusion work, it sometimes, and we struggled with this in the beginning, so much of the focus was on race that it didn't give like the full perspective of like what was happening in the organization, or or celebrate, right, all the different, the intersections of all the different identities in the organization. So that's it. And also, like, I want people to have fun and to have joy and feel like work is a space where you can both grow, you can have some of these tough conversations, but by being authentic, you can be your best self and you can show up and do your best work. I think that's what I would like to be judged by.
I mean, Jamal, I'm having so much fun in the chat over here. Like, I want to buy you dinner.
Right?
I just want to call out real quick here. There's a little bit of a shift in the schedule to where we actually have approval to run over a little bit if our speakers are able to stay on. Not sure if anybody had a hard stop, but did just want to call that out in case we had any other Q&A questions that we wanted to get to.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. There are a couple of Q&A questions that we can definitely ask our panelists, and thank you for sharing your hopes. Those are all wonderful, and I have learned so much from you during this conversation, and I look forward to continuing to learn from you and growing with you as we all engage in this work. But Nikki asked a question, are people with disabilities and neurodivergent groups included in your D&I strategies? And if so, I guess I'll go further. Like, how are you including them in your strategies?
I'm happy to take this one on. So, hi, Nikki. Amazing question. We definitely do not talk about these folks enough, to be honest. So for us, when we're dealing with folks with disabilities, neurodivergent folks, we really look at like our marketing strategy. I think that's a really great and like out of the box, like not at the tip of the tongue way to be thinking of how we can create better experiences for like our audience and also with our user base from an external impact standpoint. So just making sure that like our website is constantly checked for accessibility through various audits. Same with our social media as well, using alternate tags or alternate captions, things of that nature. I also think that in the way that we market certain areas of our product is very important. For instance, like we worked with a consultant who is focused in the disability and accessibility space. And she did a series of videos for the company about how you can make your design processes a little bit more accessible, or how you can like attack your social media strategy and things of those nature. Again, also like with your recruiting strategy too, like there are various avenues where you can explore, widening the net of the type of candidates that you bring into the pipeline. I do know that abilityjobs.com is a really great place to start if you're looking to bring in those folks in a more targeted way without it being like, hey, are you this, are you that? Because we don't want to do that anyway. So you might as well go to a resource that does highlight those groups of folks.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Amber. And then this final question from Courtney, circling back a bit on ERGs or employee resource groups. What's the best way to measure the effectiveness of ERGs and other DEI initiatives?
I'm willing to take this one.
All right, go for it, Jamal.
I think it's really important to tie the DEI work back, if you're doing culture and climate survey work, to growth, hopefully reduction in attrition, especially for folks with traditionally marginalized identities, some growth in specific areas that are targeted within the organization. Again, I think this comes back to what we've been talking about a lot today. If you didn't take anything away, is like DEI, ROI are like super important to integrate. And so I think the more that you can tie it back to those bigger arcs, to Laura's point that she was making before, the more there's more meat, and that also makes it easier to get budget because folks can see that they're really moving the needle, right? So whether it's through reduction in attrition, whether it's through again a more representative composition of your team, whether it's through improved climate and culture. We use Pecan as our culture and climate survey, and so seeing that data point move, particularly as we can disaggregate the data by identities, is like really, really helpful for us. So again, coming back to it, think about DEI if you do, and ROI, and that they're very much interrelated in any communication that you have around this. So don't just create like DEI metrics, separate DEI metrics. I think Laura said it well. It needs to be connected to whatever the focus areas are for the company, and then it makes it easier to assess the impact of employer resources groups or any other DEI initiative.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks, Jamal. Yeah, it fits with the whole conversation of making sure that everything is coherent and aligned to the organization as a whole, and that things aren't sort of siloed. So DEI and ROI, all goes together. Well, I don't see any other Q&A questions, but I want to take a moment to just thank all of you, our audience, and then the wonderful and amazing panelists. Again, I have learned so much. I can't wait to continue conversations and again, grow along with you as we continue to do this work. Allison, thank you so much for your support and allowing us to be a part of this conversation.
Totally. I don't think we could have had a better note to end on here. So thank you all so much for a great session. We do have some more awesome content coming up, if I do say so myself. So be sure to check out the agenda right there on the top of your screen. And we'll see you all super soon. Bye.
Awesome. Bye.